Hey everyone, welcome to the show.
Great to be diving in again.
Can you imagine a family argument escalating so dramatically that it literally redrew the borders of the entire world?
It sounds incredible, doesn't it? But that's essentially the core of the story we're looking at today.
It really is. This isn't just, dusty old history.
No, not at all. It's a really gripping narrative. You've got political maneuvering, these ambitious, frankly, dangerous voyages.
And consequences that just ripple outwards, things nobody expected.
Exactly. Unintended global consequences that you could argue we still feel today. It's like a real-life geopolitical thriller almost.
Yeah, definitely elements of that. Political intrigue, exploration, it's all in there.
Instead of just one kingdom, the prize was, well, potentially the whole planet.
Okay, so if you're finding these deep dives into the past as fascinating as we do, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe.
Yeah, it helps others find the show, and you won't miss what we uncover next.
So today we're plunging into Stephen R. Bound's 1494, How a Family Feud in Medieval Spain Divided the World in Half.
Great book. Really lays out the complexities.
It really does. We'll put a link to it on Amazon in the description below if you want to grab a copy.
Highly recommend it.
This book really takes you behind the scenes, doesn't it? It shows how this seemingly localized power struggle in Spain.
Right, a fight over the crown.
And the excitement over these newly discovered lands, how that all led to this absolutely pivotal treaty, a treaty that shaped centuries of global history.
And Bound highlights some surprising connections, things you wouldn't necessarily link together.
Definitely. So let's set the scene. To understand this huge drama, what was the Iberian Peninsula actually like in the late 15th century? It feels like a real pressure cooker.
It really was. Okay, so for you to picture it, you've got these two rising Christian powers dominating the peninsula. Spain, which was itself just starting to come together from Castile and Aragon, and its neighbor Portugal.
And Spain wasn't exactly a unified happy family yet, was it?
Far from it. Internally, Spain, especially Castile, was pretty unstable. Isabella's claim to the throne of Castile was seriously contested.
Because of Enrique V's daughter, Juana.
Exactly. Juana, often called La Beltranea. Many people whispered or outright believed that her father wasn't the king. This created these deep political fault lines.
And Isabella marrying Ferdinand of Aragon, that added another layer.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It definitely strengthened her position militarily and politically, but, it also worried a lot of Castilians. They feared being overshadowed by Aragon, losing their influence. It was a really delicate balancing act.
So it's not just about who wears the crown, it's about the whole future direction of these emerging nations.
Precisely. And then you have the social and religious context layered on top of all that political intrigue.
Right. What was that like?
Well, it's hard for us now, I think, to fully grasp how central religion was. You had this uneasy coexistence between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, but it was becoming increasingly fragile.
This is around the time of the Reconquista finishing.
Yes, exactly. And you see the rise of the conversos Jewish people who converted to Christianity, often under duress, which added another layer of social tension and suspicion.
And the Inquisition is looming.
The Inquisition is looming, exactly. It signals this hardening of religious attitudes, a much less tolerant atmosphere developing. Life was, mostly agrarian, infrastructure, pretty basic. You could still feel the echoes of centuries of conflict.
So while Castile is wrestling with all these internal issues, Portugal's looking outwards.
That's the key difference at this point. Portugal had this clear vision, this focus on maritime expansion. A lot of that is credited to Prince Henry.
The Navigator.
The Navigator, yeah. Although how much actual navigating he did is, well, debated. But the drive was there.
And what was the goal? Just discovery?
Oh, no, it was much more strategic than that. For you to understand their focus, they were after the source of African gold, for one. Maybe finding the mythical Christian kingdom of Prester John somewhere out there.
Right, the potential ally against Islam.
And crucially, establishing a direct sea route to India. That was the big one.
To bypass the existing trade routes.
Exactly. Bypass the Venetian and Arab middlemen who controlled the incredibly lucrative spice trade and other valuable goods coming into Europe. By the time Columbus shows up pitching his idea, Portugal was already well down this path.
Dias had already rounded the Cape of Good Hope.
Bartolomeo Dias, yes. He had rounded the Cape. And the king, João II, was a very shrewd, very focused leader. He was laser-focused on making that eastern sea route a reality for Portugal. He'd consolidated royal power and knew exactly what geographical discoveries could mean for Portugal's wealth and influence.
So Portugal's charting Africa, getting closer to India, while Castile is mostly looking inwards.
Pretty much, yeah. For you to appreciate the difference, Castile had been caught up in those internal dynastic fights, even civil war, for a big chunk of the late 15th century.
So no resources or attention for exploring westwards.
Not really significant ones, no. They had claims on the Canary Islands, sure, and some vague claims on the African coast, but their main energy was internal consolidation.
But once Ferdinand and Isabella get a firm grip,
Then things change. Then they start looking outwards, looking west. They wanted to catch up with Portugal, maybe even challenge their growing maritime power. You can almost feel the FOMO, the fear of missing out.
right, and this is where Christopher Columbus walks onto the stage, this determined Genoese sailor. How does his big idea get mixed up in this whole Spain-Portugal rivalry?
Well, Columbus, he was clearly a man of immense self-belief. Some might say more persuasive than scientifically rigorous, but definitely persistent.
He'd been shopping the idea
For
around.
years, he went to King João II of Portugal first. Makes sense. They were the leaders in exploration.
But Portugal turned him down. Why?
Okay, so you to see why, think about it from João's perspective. He already had his own exploration project, the route around Africa, which looked much more promising, much more viable.
And it was already underway.
Well underway, exactly. And, importantly, backed by papal bulls. These decrees from the Pope gave Portugal a kind of monopoly on new trade routes and lands discovered southwards in Africa, towards the Indies.
So why fund this risky westward voyage Columbus was proposing?
Precisely. Why risk resources on a long shot that might even fall outside his existing papal authority? Plus, Columbus wasn't just asking for funding.
What did he want?
He wanted a significant cut of the profits, hereditary titles, governorship of any lands discovered. These were pretty big demands. And João II was trying to centralize royal power, not hand out massive privileges. So Portugal said no.
Okay, Portugal passes. What makes Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain decide to, roll the dice on him?
Several things kind of came together for Columbus and Spain. First, that intense rivalry with Portugal we talked about. Columbus offered a potential backdoor to the riches of the East, a way for Spain to maybe leapfrog Portugal.
A gamble, but potentially a huge payoff.
A huge payoff, exactly. Second, Columbus was apparently a very skilled salesman. He knew his audience.
That's so.
He really emphasized the religious angle, the chance to spread Christianity to new lands, convert new peoples. This resonated deeply with Isabella, who was known for her strong religious convictions, especially coming right after the Reconquista, the reclaiming of Granada.
And the expulsion of the Jews.
Right. That religious fervor was high. And then, of course, there was the lure of gold. Plain and simple, new territories, new wealth. That appealed directly to Ferdinand and Isabella's ambition.
And they needed ways to reward people who'd helped them.
Definitely. They had all these hidalgos, the lower nobility, who'd fought for them and now needed new opportunities for wealth and status. Exploration offered that. They were also frustrated, remember, by Portugal's papal monopoly blocking them from the southern routes.
So despite maybe some doubts from their own experts.
Oh yes, their own advisors had reservations too. But the potential rewards Columbus was dangling just seemed too good to pass up. The potential upside outweighed the risks in their calculation.
And then 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, lands in the Americas, thinking he's near Asia. What was King João II's reaction in Portugal when the news got back?
Incandescent with rage is probably putting it mildly.
Really? That's strong.
Absolutely. For you to grasp his perspective, João firmly believed that existing papal decrees, especially the Treaty of Alcasovas from 1479, which had settled an earlier war with Castile.
Right, that treaty gave Portugal rights south of the Canaries.
Exactly, south of the Canaries and along the African coast. So in João's view, these lands Columbus found to the west directly violated Portugal's established monopoly granted by the Pope.
So he saw it as paying trespassing on his turf?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And he wasn't just going to complain. He immediately started preparing a Portuguese fleet to sail west and claim these new Indies for Portugal himself.
Wow. So a real threat of war.
A very real, very imminent threat of war between Spain and Portugal. A major diplomatic crisis blowing up.
Okay, so war is brewing. How did they try to defuse this? This is where the Pope gets pulled in, right?
Precisely. Ferdinand and Isabella, they really wanted to avoid a war. They'd just finished consolidating their power. A war with Portugal would be costly and risky. So they appealed to the highest authority they could deserve, the Pope in Rome.
And the Pope at the time was Alexander VI.
Alexander VI, yes, Rodrigo Borgia. a fascinating and controversial figure in his own right. His rise to the papacy was, let's say, politically charged.
And he had connections to Spain.
Oh, yes. Strong connections. He was Spanish himself, a Borgia from Valencia, and he had a long history with Ferdinand and Isabella. He'd even helped facilitate their marriage years before.
So Spain had an in with the Pope?
You could say that. So in 1493, Pope Alexander VI issues a series of papal bulls official decrees. The most important one for this story is called Inter Cetera.
Inter cetera. Okay, what did it do?
Essentially, for you to understand the impact, it declared that by the authority God had supposedly given him, Ferdinand and Isabella and their heirs had exclusive rights. Rights to explore, trade with, and colonize the lands Columbus had just found, and any others they might find in that direction.
Exclusive rights. So locking Portugal out.
Pretty much. And crucially, the Pope drew a line. An imaginary line running north to south down the Atlantic Ocean. Spain got everything to the west of that line. The east was implicitly left for Portugal and their existing sphere.
An imaginary line dividing the world. Just like that.
Just like that. The official justification, of course, was about preventing war between good Christian kingdoms and rewarding Spain for their crusading efforts and potential missionary work.
Preventing war, spreading the faith. Sounds noble. But how did King João II in Portugal react to this rather convenient papal line?
Predictably, he was furious. He absolutely refused to accept this initial line.
Why? What was his argument?
Well, for you to appreciate his stance, Portuguese ships were already sailing far out into the Atlantic. He argued the Pope's line was drawn too far east. It severely hampered Portugal's existing sailing routes down the African coast and potentially limited their future ambitions in the Atlantic. He basically said, this isn't fair. It boxes us in.
So he pushed back.
He pushed back hard. He demanded the line be moved further west. This led to direct, very intense negotiations between Spanish and Portuguese diplomats. High-stakes stuff.
And this leads to the Treaty of Tordesillas.
Exactly. All this negotiation, under the threat of conflict, culminates in the signing of the Treaty of Tordesillas in June 1494. Think of it as a global territorial negotiation under extreme pressure.
The Treaty of Tordesillas, that name really does echo, doesn't it? What were the key changes? What's most important for us to understand about its terms?
The absolute crucial point for you to grasp is that the treaty moved the Pope's original line. It shifted it significantly westward. 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands.
370 leagues. How far is that, roughly?
It's debated exactly how long a league was then, but roughly 1,200 miles or so. A substantial shift westwards.
And that was a win for Portugal.
A major diplomatic victory for João II. It gave his ships much more room to maneuver in the South Atlantic on their way around Africa, but it also had this completely unforeseen consequence. That westward shift inadvertently placed the eastern bulge of South America, what would later become Brazil, squarely on the Portuguese side of the line.
Whoa. So Portugal got Brazil because they pushed the line west.
Essentially, yes. Now, some historians debate whether João II maybe already had some secret reports, some inkling that there was land out there.
Interesting.
But the official European discovery of Brazil by Cabral doesn't happen until 1500, 6 years after the treaty. Regardless of whether João knew or not, the treaty effectively gave Portugal dibs on Brazil.
So Tordesillas carves up the known and unknown non-European world into two zones. Spain gets the west, Portugal gets the east, including Africa, the route to India, and accidentally or not, Brazil.
That's the essence of it, a bilateral agreement dividing the globe.
So this treaty, it did manage to head off immediate war, right?
For the time being, yes, it preserved peace between Spain and Portugal.
But what were the consequences? For Spain and Portugal, what did this division mean in the short and medium term?
Well, for both of them, the immediate consequence was, frankly, a massive boost. It propelled them into becoming the world's first truly global superpowers.
Because of the monopolies.
Exactly. The monopolies granted by the treaty, which were later reinforced by other papal bulls, gave them exclusive access, at least in theory, to vast new resources and trade routes.
So Portugal gets rich from...
Portugal absolutely flourished from controlling that eastern sea route around Africa. Spices, silks, precious stones from India and the Spice Islands. Incredible wealth flowed into Lisbon.
And Spain.
Spain, with its claim to the Americas, eventually hit the jackpot too. After the brutal conquests of the Aztec, Mayan, and Inca empires,
Right.
a staggering amount of gold and silver started pouring into Spain from the mines of Mexico and Peru. By the mid-16th century, these two Iberian nations were the dominant global players, shaping world trade and building vast overseas empires. You really had to visualize them as the two giants on the world stage.
But surely, The rest of Europe, England, France, the Dutch, they weren't just going to sit back and politely watch Spain and Portugal carve up the entire planet.
Absolutely not. No way. For you to see their perspective, this treaty explicitly excluded them. All these potential riches, these new lands, these trade routes, they were locked out.
That must have created huge resentment.
Deep resentment, yes, and a growing determination to challenge this Iberian duopoly. Now, initially it was tricky.
Because of the Pope's authority?
Exactly. Especially before the Protestant Reformation really took hold in Northern Europe. Openly defying a papal decree that divided the world was a serious, risky business.
But that changed.
It did change. As the 16th century wore on, and especially as papal authority weakened in some areas, these excluded nations started looking for ways, anyway, to get a piece of the action. They started trying to circumvent the treaty's restrictions.
Oh, what did that look like?
Well, it started with things like piracy, smuggling, basically ignoring the monopolies. And eventually, it escalated into outright military conflict. Think of them as determined gatecrashers at a very, very exclusive party, and they're starting to push the doors open.
So this division, this line meant to bring peace between Spain and Portugal, it actually ends up becoming a major source of conflict for everyone else.
That's a key takeaway, I think. It became a central grievance, a major catalyst for centuries of competition and conflict on a global scale.
So how did these challenges actually play out? You mentioned piracy.
Right. You see the rise of English privateers, state-sponsored pirates, essentially. Figures like John Hawkins and later Sir Francis Drake.
Drake, right. Famous for raiding Spanish ships.
Exactly. They aggressively challenged Spanish power, particularly in the Caribbean. They engaged in illegal trading in Spanish ports, raided settlements, attacked the treasure fleets carrying gold and silver back to Spain.
And the Dutch, they challenged Portugal.
The Dutch became major challengers, particularly to the Portuguese monopoly in the East Indies, modern-day Indonesia and surrounding areas. They formed powerful trading companies, like the Dutch East India Company, the VOC.
The VOC, yeah. Almost like a state within a state.
Pretty much. It had its own armies, its own ships, and they fought numerous wars with the Portuguese throughout Southeast Asia, eventually displacing them from many key trading posts in the spice trade.
So these weren't just minor skirmishes. These were serious challenges reshaping global power.
Absolutely. These were major conflicts that fundamentally altered global trade networks and shifted the balance of power away from the initial Iberian dominance.
And it's against this backdrop of conflict and challenge that new ideas start to emerge, right? Ideas challenging the whole concept of dividing the world up like this.
Exactly. The concept of the free sea really starts to gain traction here.
How did that come about?
Well, a really pivotal moment for you to understand this shift happened in the early 1600s. The Dutch captured a Portuguese merchant ship, the Santa Catarina, in the Strait of Malacca.
Okay, an act of piracy from the Portuguese view.
Definitely piracy from the Portuguese perspective.
Yeah.
But the Dutch East India Company needed a legal justification for seizing the ship and its valuable cargo. So they hired a brilliant young Dutch lawyer.
Hugo Grotius.
Hugo Grotius, yes. And in 1609, Grotius published, initially anonymously, this groundbreaking work called Mare Liberum.
Mare Liberum, the free sea.
The free sea. And for you to grasp its significance, Grotius's arguments went way beyond just defending this one specific ship seizure. He launched a fundamental attack on the entire legal basis of the Treaty of Tordesillas and the papal bulls it rested on.
How did he argue that?
He argued that the oceans, the high seas, by their very nature, they're vast, they're constantly moving, they're essential for communication and trade between all peoples. They simply cannot be owned or monopolized by any single nation or pair of nations.
So nobody can own the sea.
That was his core argument. He asserted that the freedom of the seas was a fundamental principle of natural law, derived from God or reason, and therefore accessible to everyone, to all nations.
Wow. So Grotius is essentially dismantling the whole legal and moral framework that Spain and Portugal had built their empires on. He's laying the groundwork for a totally different way of thinking about international waters.
Precisely. Now, his immediate goal was obviously to serve Dutch interests, justifying their breaking into the Portuguese and Spanish monopolies. But he framed his arguments in these universal terms, appealing to natural law and the common good of humanity.
Advocating for the right of all nations to sail and trade freely.
Exactly. He directly attacked the idea of a closed sea, a mare clausum, controlled by just one or two powers. And for you to appreciate its lasting impact, Mare Liberum, even though it caused outrage in Spain and Portugal, even got put on the Vatican's list of forbidden books.
Really?
Oh, yes. Despite all that, it became a foundational text for modern international law, especially maritime law. It profoundly shaped how we think about the oceans, navigation rights, resource access, even today.
That's incredible. Truly remarkable how a treaty hammered out in 1494, stemming from essentially a family succession crisis.
Right, and fears of war between cousins.
It could have such incredibly far-reaching consequences, spanning centuries, leading to global conflict, and even sparking the development of entirely new legal principles like the freedom of the seas. What do you see as the ultimate legacy of Tordesillas for us today?
I think the Treaty of Tordesillas stands as this powerful example of how agreements made in one specific historical moment can ripple outwards in ways the creators never imagined. Born from that feud and papal politics, it became, as we said, a major point of friction,
Fueling conflict for centuries.
fueling nearly 2 centuries of conflict, piracy, smuggling, espionage, outright war across the globe. It profoundly shaped how European colonialism unfolded, how European powers interacted with each other and with the rest of the world. For you to really think about it, a seemingly simple line on a map had this immense, complex, and lasting impact on global politics, on trade, and as we saw with Grotius, on the very foundations of international law.
It's a potent reminder, isn't it, that decisions made long ago, often for reasons specific to that time, can cast incredibly long shadows.
Absolutely. They continue to shape the geopolitical landscape, the economic realities, even the legal frameworks we live with today.
Okay, so just to quickly recap for everyone listening, we started with this contested throne in Spain, tangled up with Portugal's big maritime dreams.
Mhm.
Then Columbus arrives, finds land across the Atlantic, and King João of Portugal is furious, threatening war.
Which leads to the Pope stepping in, drawing that first line.
A line Portugal rejects, leading to negotiations and the crucial Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494.
Shifting the line west, giving Portugal Brazil, and setting up Spain and Portugal as the first global superpowers, thanks to their monopolies.
But those monopolies didn't sit well with England, France, the Netherlands.
Nope. Leading to centuries of challenge piracy, privateering, trade wars.
And ultimately, new ideas challenging the whole concept, like Hugo Grotius and Mare Liberum, the freedom of the seas.
It's an incredible chain reaction, really. What started as a way to prevent war between two neighbors ended up reshaping the entire world and the rules governing it.
In ways no one in 1494 could possibly have foreseen.
Not even close. For you, it really underscores how interconnected the world was even back then, and how actions in one corner could have global repercussions.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? For you listening, consider this. How do seemingly arbitrary decisions, like drawing lines on maps centuries ago, continue to echo in our present world order? Can you think of other historical lines in the sand that have had similarly profound, unexpected consequences?
That's a great question to ponder.
Or maybe think about it this way. Given our modern ideas about international law, sovereignty, human rights, how do we even begin to reconcile the justifications used back in 1494 for dividing up the world between just two European powers?
Vital questions, lots to chew on there.
Well, that brings us towards the end of another really fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us as we unpack this pivotal, world-altering treaty.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. It's a story that really highlights ambition, rivalry, unintended consequences, all writ large on a global scale.
We hope you found it insightful. We genuinely love to hear what stood out most to you. What was your biggest aha moment from our discussion today?
Or maybe what surprised you most about the Treaty of Tordesillas and its impact?
Let us know. Share your favorite takeaway or surprising fact in the comments section below.
We do read them.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive and you think maybe a friend or colleague might find it interesting too, please do hit that like button and share it with them.
It really helps.
Thanks again for tuning in. We look forward to our next exploration into the depths of knowledge with you all.